Step into the Timeless Tales library, where each story unfolds like a soft whisper, guiding you gently into a realm of restful calm. I'm Oliver, your host, and tonight I'll weave a tranquil tale to quiet your thoughts and lull you towards slumber. The Timeless Tales library thrives thanks to the support of listeners like you. If these stories bring you peace, please subscribe to help us keep crafting these serene escapes. As you cozy up, drop a comment below to share where you're tuning in from tonight and tell us a destination you'd love a story to transport you to, perhaps Prague, Kauai, the Andes, or Yosemite. Your dreams light the way for our little library's glow. Tonight's story is about... On a foggy London evening, Miss Eleanor Finch, a teacher at the St. Hildegard School for Girls, arrives at 221B Baker Street with a subtle, unsettling worry. Her carefully kept journal has vanished. In the warm glow of the sitting room, Holmes and Watson follow delicate traces of habit, memory, and attention, uncovering a quiet mystery that restores not just a lost object, but the fragile rhythm of a life lived in gentle order. Now, close your eyes and allow your body to settle. The day is behind you, and its sounds are fading. Notice the quiet around you, a soft blanket of stillness. Let that stillness flow into your mind, calming the constant chatter of thoughts. Now, as you breathe, imagine a doorway opening in your mind. This is a special door, one that leads to a place of complete rest and calm. Beyond it lies the Timeless Tales library. This is a place made just for you, a haven where stories are whispered, not read. Every word is like a gentle breeze, every sentence a soft note of music. Tonight, we step through that door together. Your bed is a private armchair by a crackling fire, the blankets a cozy throw, and the world outside has faded away. There is only this moment, this quiet room, and the tale about to begin. Let the story be your guide, a quiet current to carry you towards sleep. Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Violet Journal. The fog had descended upon London that evening with the patient certainty of a tide. It did not rush, nor sweep, nor fall with violence. Rather, it arrived as though it had always been waiting at the city's threshold, prepared to slip inside when the moment was right. It coiled around the lampposts and seeped into alleyways, rolling with unhurried grace, until even the boldest outlines of roofs and chimneys were reduced to soft silhouettes. What light remained was scattered and pale, stretched thin across the damp air, until it appeared to come from nowhere, in particular, a ghostly glow without source or direction. It was not, I reflected, the cruel fog of winter, a biting frozen curtain that sliced the skin and stung the eyes, but a gentler kind, a fog of late autumn, holding within it the scent of rain-soaked earth and the faint sweetness of coal smoke drifting from 1,000 hearths. There was a richness to its dampness, a scent that seemed half mineral, half vegetal, like wet stone overlaid with rotting leaves. It made the very air taste of the river, as if the Thames itself had risen into the sky to wander among the streets. From our windows at Baker Street, the familiar scene was reduced to an impressionist's canvas, swirls of grey, smudges of dark, the occasional glow of a lantern haloed by vapor. The steady noise of the metropolis was muffled into something strangely intimate. The clatter of cab wheels became the muted roll of distant thunder. The calls of street vendors blurred into a low drone, like the hum of bees behind a wall, even the bell of street. Mary's down the road, which usually rang with an iron finality, now carried across the air as though through cloth, its edges softened, its authority subdued. London, for once, seemed to be whispering. I found myself oddly comforted by the hush. Time had changed me more than I liked to admit. The younger man who had marched through battlefields and hurried to Holmes's side at the first whiff of danger had long since ceded ground to an older self, one who welcomed slowness, who found value in pauses, who sought solace in the small hours when the world seemed content to rest. It struck me, as I sat in my chair that evening, that fog is a mercy granted to the weary. It obscures the world's sharpness, muffles its noise, and allows one to feel, if only briefly, that life itself has quieted its relentless pace. Inside, the fire became a sun in miniature, the true center of our universe that night. Its glow licked the legs of the table and gleamed on the brass fittings of Holmes's instruments, painting each familiar object with a gentler radiance. The flames moved with a rhythm all their own, now darting upward with restless energy, now sinking into a red pool of embers that pulsed as if with some hidden breath. There is, I think, no sound quite as companionable as the sound of burning wood. The small sighs, the sudden snaps, the soft crumbling of ash. I had heard it 1,000 times in my life, in camps, inns and parlours, but never did it feel so home-like as in that cluttered sitting-room on Baker Street. The smells of the place were a symphony to me, the pungent sweetness of shag tobacco from Holmes's pipe, faint but pervasive, the rich, oily tang of polish on old leather, the dry dust of ancient volumes lined upon shelves like loyal soldiers. All these mingled with the warm scent of coal and burning pine from the hearth until the air itself seemed to embrace me. It was, I thought, the scent of continuity, unchanging, familiar, and all the more precious because of how much else in life had changed. The book upon my lap, Horace in Latin, might have been a companion too, but I confess I had long ceased to follow its lines. My eyes had become captive to the fire, tracing the twists of flame, as if each were a line of verse in some language older and more profound than any written text. There are moments when reading is impossible because life itself insists on being read, and this was such a night. The ticking of the clock upon the mantel, steady and unhurried, formed a counterpoint to the restless fire, as though reminding both flame and man that time, unlike smoke and spark, will not leap nor falter, but only proceed. Across the room, Holmes reclined upon the sofa. His stillness was nearly statuesque. One long arm was folded over his chest, the fingers loosely steepled, while the other hand allowed a pipe to rest lightly between thumb and forefinger. His eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, yet I knew better than to assume he slept. A faint ribbon of smoke ascended from the bowl, twisting itself into arabesques that mingled with the shadows on the ceiling before vanishing into nothing. The sight carried a kind of ritual solemnity, as though the smoke were an offering to some hidden god of contemplation. Those unfamiliar with my friend might have mistaken the tableau for indolence, but I had grown too intimate with his habits not to know the truth. It was in this very stillness, this apparent repose, that his mind was most active. He would let it drift, like a net cast upon a silent pond, gathering the smallest ripples, the faintest disturbances, the overlooked fragments of perception that others ignored. If in his waking hours he was a razor sharp, precise, swift, then in these hours he was a mirror, reflecting with endless patience whatever truths dared to present themselves. I regarded him with a curious mixture of admiration and concern. Holmes remained a man of remarkable vitality, but I could not deny that the years had etched their quiet toll upon him. His hair had silvered at the temples, the lines at his mouth and eyes, once faint, now carved with deeper persistence. The very intensity that had made him so singular seemed at times to have drained him more swiftly than it might another man. I saw, in those moments of repose, a fragility that I did not think he himself would ever acknowledge. Yet I cherished those glimpses all the more, for they revealed the humanity beneath the genius, the man who sought peace as much as discovery. I, for my part, was not immune to reflection. The stiffness in my knees when I rose, the heaviness in my chest when I climbed the stairs, the occasional tremor in my hand, all spoke to me more eloquently than any calendar of the years that had passed. And yet I found an unexpected grace in this season of life. Age lends one not merely aches, but also a gentler perspective, a slower pace, a keener appreciation of small comforts, a greater willingness to sit quietly and allow the world to unfold at its own tempo. The fog outside, the fire within, the companionship beside me, what more could one require? The very atmosphere is a balm, is it not, Watson? Holmes's voice, low and deliberate, rose suddenly into the room, as if emerging from the fire itself. He did not open his eyes, yet his words seemed to fill the air with a calm authority. "It is," I replied softly, unwilling to break the spell with too much sound. "The city's din is subdued, the air softened. It feels as though the world has been wrapped in velvet." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, a velvet lining to the common air that is well said. You see, in such quiet one may discern the subtle truths that clamour conceals. When the great engines of life pause, however briefly, the delicate anomalies make themselves known. It is in the finest ripple on the placid surface that one perceives the truest currents beneath. He fell silent again, leaving me with words that seemed less like conversation than like fragments of a larger meditation he shared only with himself. I had grown accustomed to these utterances, little windows into a philosophy he rarely articulated, but always lived. I did not press him for explanation. Instead, I let the thought linger in me, like the slow dissolving of sugar in tea. The silence returned, deeper now, layered with meaning. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, the fog pressed its face against the glass. I felt suspended in a pocket of time, as though all London might have ceased while only we remained. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts blurred into that half-world between waking and sleep, where every sound seems both real and imagined. It was in that tender interval that a new sound entered the room. At first I thought it only the shifting of wood in the grate, or the faint creak of timbers adjusting to the damp. But then it came again, a knock, not loud, not urgent, a mere tapping, soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. So faint was it that it might have been a trick of the fog, some stray droplet striking the window pane. But no, it was at the door. I turned my gaze toward Holmes. His eyes remained closed, but his head had inclined fractionally, the barest acknowledgment that he had heard it too. His stillness did not waver, yet the room felt suddenly alert. I rose slowly, the stiffness of my joints reminding me of my age, and crossed to the door. Each step seemed amplified in the hush, the floorboards creaking like old confidants betraying my passage. When I opened it, I found Mrs. Hudson standing in the hall, her face touched with a gentle uncertainty, and behind her, half shrouded in the mist that had followed her in, stood a figure, a young woman, cloaked in grey, dew beads glistening upon her shoulders like a scattering of stars. Her eyes met mine, luminous, sorrowful, and deeply still. Miss Eleanor Finch sat before us, her posture impeccable yet contained, as if she had learned to measure her every gesture from childhood. Even so, the slightest tremor of her fingers betrayed her tension, a delicate rhythm that pulsed quietly against the otherwise serene impression she projected. She clasped her hands in her lap, then released them, then clasped again, a muted metronome of uncertainty. Watson, I thought, is usually the first to notice such subtleties, but I found myself equally captivated, studying the faint chalk smudges on her sleeve, the careful stitching of her gloves, the slight dampness upon the tips of her shoes. Holmes's eyes, as always, were the most discerning, noting everything without apparent movement. "My life, Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice soft and deliberate, "has not been remarkable, yet in its quietness I have become attuned to small disturbances those subtle anomalies that seem to ripple beneath the surface of ordinary days. Her gaze wandered to the fire, tracing the dance of flame across the rug. I could see in her eyes a careful restraint, a habit of watching, of measuring, of hiding her thoughts until she deemed them safe to reveal. "I teach at Street Hildegard's School for Girls," she continued, "though I was once a governess. In each role I have lived a life of repetition and observation, noting patterns where others see only the obvious. My pupils rarely notice me beyond the lessons I give. Yet, in my silence, I have come to know them more deeply than perhaps they themselves know." I watched her fingers, pale and long, as they folded and unfolded, tracing invisible paths along the lace of her gloves. She moved with care, her body conserving space and energy, as if every motion were a calculated offering to decorum. Holmes's gaze lingered there, and I could see the familiar flicker of his mind at work, cataloguing the small details, the faint wear at the wrist, the slight looseness of the gloves at the fingers, the faint but consistent pressure of her grip, each a word in the silent autobiography she carried on her person. Miss Finch's voice softened further, becoming almost a murmur. "I rise before my pupils each morning, preparing lessons, reviewing the exercises of the previous day, mending quarrels both small and subtle. The streets I traverse are narrow and often empty at dawn. The fog rolls in over the lamps like a curtain, damp and thick, carrying with it the scent of coal and wet stone. I walk with care, lest my footstep disturb the quiet, and often I pause at the windows of familiar shops, simply to watch the mist curl over their panes." Holmes inclined his head slightly, the barest movement, but it was enough to indicate his attention. His eyes, half-lidded, did not miss the cadence of her words, the precise manner in which she separated syllables, nor the brief hesitations between sentences, the subtle markers of a mind trained in self-discipline, yet accustomed to internalizing its own turbulence. "My rooms above the dressmaker's shop are small," she said, "yet I have arranged them as a haven, a place where order may reign over chaos, where every book and object has its place. I take my evening meal at a small table by the window, watching the city darken and listening to its softened chorus. The muted clatter of wheels, the occasional cry of a distant street vendor, the whisper of the fog itself as it settles over rooftops, these hours of solitude are mine alone." Watson, I knew, was absorbing this in his usual way, noting the eloquence of her words, the care with which she measured each statement, and the faint tremor of her emotions beneath the surface. Holmes, however, remained in the shadow of his chair, eyes flicking subtly between her hands, her face, and the curve of her shoulders. "You live with a quiet rigor, Miss Finch," he observed softly, "yet your presence carries traces of strain. The faint dust upon your cuffs speaks to your daily labors, the careful folding of your hands to years of restraint, the tone of your voice to habitual vigilance. You are accustomed to ordering your surroundings, and yet some recent occurrence has reached beyond your defenses. That is why you have come to us. Her lips parted in surprise, though she did not recoil. Yes, she said, her voice barely above the fire's crackle. It is not a matter of theft, nor one of peril, but of intrusion into the very patterns of my life. It has unsettled the solitude I have cultivated for so long. I find myself adrift in spaces that were once familiar. A long silence followed. I could hear only the fire, the ticking clock, and the quiet pulse of her breathing. I sensed the weight of the moment, the hesitation of someone unused to speaking aloud, the delicate terrors of an ordinary life. Holmes did not speak, but I could feel the movement of his thoughts, the gentle meditative exploration of the invisible threads that bound her words, gestures, and presence into a tapestry only he could read. My childhood was quiet, she began at last, though not unhappy. My father, a man of letters, passed when I was 10, and my mother followed within a year. An elder brother, much older, chose a path far from mine, and I was left to the care of distant relatives who offered only what duty required. In such a household, I learned the virtues of silence, of usefulness without acknowledgement, and of being seen but rarely heard. When the time came for me to earn my own way, teaching became a natural choice. It valued quiet observation, discipline, and patience, all traits I had already honed. Holmes inclined his head once more, the faintest movement acknowledging the patterns she revealed unconsciously. Each of her words, each gesture, each subtle inflection confirmed the deductions he had already formed in the silent observation of her. He did not need her confession, it only confirmed the invisible ledger he had been keeping since her arrival. My days are simple, she continued, yet filled with small, measured duties. I rise before the girls, prepare lessons, guide them through recitations, mend their quarrels, and walk the same narrow lanes to and from the schoolhouse. The seasons change outside my window, but within my walls repetition reigns. And yet, here her voice trembled, even within such repetition, an anomaly appeared, something not sought, not invited, but nevertheless undeniable. Her gaze, when it returned to the fire, seemed almost to penetrate the flickering flames, seeing not their light but some memory or vision she did not yet speak aloud. I noticed the faint shadowing beneath her eyes, the subtle pull at the corners of her mouth, the careful tension in her shoulders. She was young, but her endurance was remarkable. Her presence exuded both fragility and resilience. Holmes stirred, his fingers tapping lightly together in their characteristic rhythm. "It is clear," he said, "that your existence has been one of structure and deliberate simplicity. That something should intrude upon it indicates not merely an external object or event, but a disturbance touching your inner life. You would not have come here for mere lost property, Miss Finch. This matter reaches beyond that. You are aware of it yourself, though perhaps uncertain how to name it." She looked at him, astonished, yet with no disbelief, only recognition. "You speak as though you have read my very thoughts," she murmured. "I have read only what you present," he replied quietly, "but the question remains whether you are prepared to name this disruption, whether to us, or perhaps first to yourself." Miss Finch drew a slow, deliberate breath. "I think I am ready," she said, "though it began, as I said, with a journal. You must understand the days that led me to it. The journal did not arrive in my life by accident, nor by ordinary chance. It came after a quiet succession of ordinary hours, and it struck me at the very root of my solitude." Her voice softened, almost reverently, as the firelight danced upon her features. She sat poised on the edge of revelation, and in that poised silence I felt the full weight of her life, its careful construction, its disciplined solitude, and the gentle tremors that had brought her to our door. Evenings in Miss Finch's life were a slow, deliberate procession, marked by the soft patter of her own footsteps and the subtle sighs of a city settling into the fog. The streets she walked were narrow, cobbled with uneven stones that caught the lamplight in small pools of gold. The fog rolled between the buildings like a gentle tide, curling around her cloak, clinging to her gloves, muffling the distant clatter of horse-drawn cabs and the occasional rattle of a shop shutter. Every sound was softened. The city spoke in whispers, not shouts. Miss Finch had told us of her small rooms above the dressmaker's shop, but I imagined them now with greater clarity, a modest space, dominated by a single window overlooking the street below, where the gaslight pooled like honey upon the stones. A narrow writing desk bore a small collection of books, a neat stack of paper, and an inkwell whose glass caught the firelight and threw tiny prisms across the walls. A simple bed, tucked neatly into one corner, was made with crisp linen, the folds of the sheets smoothed by her careful hands. Each object bore the marks of meticulous order. Nothing was extraneous, yet nothing lacked presence. She prepared her evening meal with quiet ceremony, a modest repast, a small bowl of broth, a slice of bread, and a cup of tea, whose steam formed delicate curls above the cup. Each gesture was deliberate, the careful folding of the napkin, the precise placement of the spoon, the gentle stirring of the tea. There was a rhythm to it, a meditative precision, as though every action were a small ritual to anchor her to the ordered world she had constructed. I could almost see her taking the time to breathe slowly between tasks, listening to the muffled city beyond the window, feeling the fog press against the glass. She might pause to lean her forehead against the cool pane, tracing its outline with a fingertip and watching the dim figures of passers-by, caught for an instant in the lamplight before dissolving into grey. Even the smallest details, the way a shop sign swayed, the soft creak of a door, became part of her evening's tapestry, quietly catalogued in the mind of one accustomed to observing without intrusion. Holmes, I knew, would have taken note of every such detail had he been present in those rooms. The rhythm of her movements, the way she balanced the weight of her solitude, the careful attention she paid to small, repeated gestures that might seem trivial but were, in truth, the essence of her character. At the desk, she would spend the hours she called her own in quiet study. Perhaps a small lamp burned at her side, casting a cone of soft light upon her papers. She would catalogue the day's observations, review sketches of plants, trace the careful lines of leaves and petals with a steady hand. Her mind, trained by years of careful study, would linger over minutiae that most would dismiss: the slight curling of a leaf, the gradual deepening of a hue, the delicate asymmetry that rendered each blossom unique. Here was a world she controlled, a world where nothing was lost unless she permitted it, and in which her thoughts could move freely, uninterrupted by the demands of others. Even in these quiet hours, she was never idle. Her hands would mend torn pages, straighten lines of text, and arrange specimens with an almost ritual precision. Holmes would have observed her finger movements with particular interest, the way her thumb might rest against a corner of a page, the slight pressure she applied when sketching, the careful spacing between objects that revealed an innate desire for balance and symmetry. Watson, no doubt, would have been drawn to the subtle harmony she maintained between motion and stillness, the poetry of her gestures performed with minimal disturbance to the room's order. And yet, even amid such carefully cultivated calm, an anomaly could appear: a misplaced page, a faint smudge of ink, the sound of a carriage louder than usual, or a shadow that did not belong. These would intrude upon her quiet world with a force all the more potent because it was unexpected. Her sensitivity, honed by years of solitude, made her acutely aware of such disturbances. The ordinary world for her was a tapestry of subtle interactions, and when the threads were tugged even slightly, the disturbance was immediately perceptible. It was on such an evening, as she tended her sketches and catalogued her notes, that the anomaly first appeared. Perhaps a knock at the door, faint and hesitant, barely audible above the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Perhaps a slip of paper that fluttered from her desk onto the floor. Perhaps a curious draught, carrying the scent of damp fog and distant chimneys, brushing against her sleeve. Whatever it was, it caused her heart to catch, a small, quiet dislocation in her ordered existence. I could imagine her pausing, the pencil suspended mid-stroke, her gaze drifting to the window as though seeking an explanation in the curling fog. Her breath would catch slightly, and for a moment she would sit very still, feeling the delicate tremor of the ordinary disrupted. Watson might have described such a moment as unease. Holmes would have catalogued it as a ripple on the surface, a subtle but meaningful deviation from her habitual pattern. Even then, her reactions would be measured, almost imperceptible. She would place the pencil down carefully, fold her hands, and lean slightly forward in her chair. Perhaps she traced the edge of a page, or pressed her fingertips against the polished surface of her desk, grounding herself in the familiar texture. Each motion, deliberate yet unhurried, was both a shield and a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted, yet she retained control. And so the stage was set, the orderly world of Miss Finch, a life lived in careful repetition, interrupted by an anomaly that was neither violent nor dramatic, but profound precisely in its subtlety. It was into this delicate rhythm, this carefully measured existence, that the first hint of the missing journal began to emerge, unspoken yet insistent, whispering of a disturbance that demanded attention. The evening she first sensed the anomaly began, as Miss Finch had told us, like any other. The fog had thickened since her walk home from the school, clinging to her cloak and muffling the city into a soft, monochrome world. She had paused at her window to watch the dim glow of a lantern wobble along the cobblestones, its light refracted in the mist like a jewel submerged in water. The air was damp but not cold, scented faintly with coal smoke and wet leaves, carrying that peculiar sweetness of London after rain. Inside her room, the small fire in the hearth burned low, the flames hissing gently against the logs. The shadows stretched lazily across the walls, tracing elongated shapes of chairs and books, moving with an almost hypnotic, deliberate rhythm. She settled at her writing desk, the one she had arranged so carefully each evening, and took up her pencil. The sketches she had begun that afternoon were neatly stacked, leaves in mid-unfurling, petals curling at their edges, the subtle gradations of violet captured with painstaking patience. Yet, that evening, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, a slight pressure that caused her to pause mid-stroke, pencil hovering above the paper. A faint rustle reached her ears, perhaps the settling of the floorboards in the shop below, or a distant cough carried by the fog. She leaned back slightly in her chair, fingers pressing gently against her lips, listening to the quiet. The usual rhythm of her evenings, measured, predictable, A careful ballet of movements had been disrupted by the subtle insistence of a sound or sensation she could not name. Holmes, I knew, would have catalogued every nuance she later described. The placement of her hands, the slight tilt of her head, the way her breath caught in minor increments, all were indicators of a mind alert to the faintest deviations from order. Watson would notice her posture, the careful way she adjusted the folds of her dress, the habitual tightening of her lips when deep in thought. In the smallest gestures the truth of her unease was already written. She rose, almost unconsciously, to check the window. The fog pressed against the glass, curling in delicate tendrils, yet no figure could be discerned. A lantern swung in the distance, slow and irregular, the light obscured and diffused. She pressed a hand to the cool pane, feeling the tremor of something unsettled beneath her skin. It was not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness, an intuition that the ordinary symmetry of her world had been shifted ever so slightly. Returning to her desk, she laid her hands upon the papers again. Her mind, trained for years in careful observation of minute details, immediately scanned the room, each book in its place, each pencil aligned with the precision of habit, each leaf sketched with the usual attention. Yet, as her gaze fell upon the stack of journals and notebooks, she hesitated. One book, placed atop another, seemed different. The edge of the leather was slightly uneven, a faint indentation marking a momentary lapse in her careful alignment. She reached for it with cautious fingers, aware of the peculiar tightness in her chest. The journal itself, she realized, was not immediately apparent. It had been moved, but not in any way that suggested malice or intrusion, no disorder, no sign of theft. Just a subtle dislocation, like a ripple on a still pond, perceptible only to someone attuned to every detail of their environment. Holmes would have smiled at this, I thought. He would have seen in her hesitation the precise manifestation of a small ripple, the very thing he had described that evening in Baker Street. Watson, in turn, would note the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor of her hands as she prepared to investigate, and the way she balanced composure with instinctive curiosity. Hours passed in quiet contemplation. She examined her shelves, her desk, her carefully arranged collections, finding nothing overtly missing, yet knowing instinctively that something was displaced. The fog outside thickened, as if to mirror the slight confusion pressing upon her. Each tick of her small clock on the mantel seemed louder, each crackle of the fire sharper, punctuating the silent investigation of her own mind. It was during this patient search, this slow, almost meditative observation of her surroundings, that she first felt the nature of the intrusion. It was not a thing that could be located easily, nor a disturbance to her belongings, but to her very sense of order. the delicate pattern of habit and routine that formed the framework of her days. The journal, the small leather-bound witness to the life of the rare Violet, had vanished, not violently but quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the interstices of her own actions. Holmes, seated on the sofa, would later remark that this was precisely the sort of subtlety he favoured, the anomaly that revealed not only the movement of objects, but the interior life of the observer, the ripple that spoke of the interplay between attention and distraction, the faint tremor that signaled the human mind's susceptibility to displacement. Watson, ever more sympathetic, would marvel at the quiet suffering of Miss Finch, a young woman undone not by malice, but by the gentle misalignment of her own meticulous world. In that evening, before she ventured to Baker Street, she wrestled with her thoughts. She traced the edges of each notebook, shuffled papers with precise motions, and questioned her own memory had she misplaced it herself, or had some unseen hand intervened. Each theory seemed simultaneously plausible and inadequate. The fog outside pressed against her window pane as if the city itself held its breath, aware of her subtle disquiet. Finally, with a soft exhale, she realized she could do no more alone. The intrusion, minor though it might appear to others, demanded attention beyond herself. It was a gentle but insistent disturbance that reached into the solitude of her ordered existence, prompting her to seek out those capable of perceiving not only objects but the rhythms of the mind. And so she walked, through fog and lamplight, to 221B, Baker Street, guided by intuition, not urgency, the quiet summons of a small mystery that required calm reflection rather than haste. By the time she knocked upon our door, faintly, hesitantly, the stage had been fully set. The ordered world of Miss Finch, attuned to subtle detail, had encountered a ripple, a displacement that spoke to both the material and the interior. Holmes's mind would detect it instantly. Watson's eye would observe the traces of quiet anxiety, and hers the delicate balance between consternation and curiosity, led her into our rooms to begin the gentle unraveling of the mystery that was both external and profoundly personal. The fog outside Baker Street had grown denser by the time Miss Finch had taken her seat, the lamps along the street casting diffuse halos that seemed to float in the grey embrace. Within our sitting room the fire burned lower than earlier, a subdued, steady glow, and the clock's ticking had slowed in harmony with the gentle breathing of the room. Holmes, reclining in his usual posture, eyes half closed, seemed almost absorbed into the shadows themselves. Watson, seated near the hearth, observed the newcomer with the patient attention of a man who had long learned to read both gestures and silences. Miss Finch's hands lay folded in her lap, the small folds of her gloves soft and worn from years of careful use. She was a study in stillness, yet her eyes betrayed a restless inward motion, the flitting attention of a mind sensitive to minute disturbances. Holmes, whose own attention had been momentarily suspended in contemplative ease, now stirred, fingers steepled lightly, as if the arrival of this subtle disturbance had finally roused him fully from meditative repose. "The journal," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It was not stolen. I am certain of it, but it has vanished from my sight. I cannot locate it, and yet the plant, the sketches, the table, everything else remains as I left it." She paused, drawing a slow, calming breath, the kind practiced by those who had long mastered the art of quiet observation. Holmes inclined his head slightly, a silent invitation to continue. "And you noticed this absence when?" he asked, his voice a low, comforting rumble, carrying no urgency, but a patient curiosity that seemed to warm the room as effectively as the fire. "Upon returning from the herbarium," she replied, "in the evening. I had expected to record a new leaf, its curve and color noted as always, yet the journal was gone. At first, I thought perhaps I had set it aside carelessly, but," she faltered slightly, her hands pressing lightly against her knees, "but there was no sign of disorder. Nothing could have removed it without my noticing, and yet I could not find it." Watson's gaze moved over her hands, noting the slight tension in the knuckles and the faint tremor in her fingers. Even in a room so carefully arranged, the human element betrayed itself. Holmes, conversely, did not need to observe outward signs. His perception extended into the quiet patterns of thought itself, the rhythms of attention and distraction, and the invisible traces left by moments of absent-mindedness. Holmes spoke at last, his voice calm, his tone almost conversational. "Miss Finch, what you describe is a subtle disturbance, not a violent one. It is not an act of theft, nor one of malice, but rather a displacement, a quiet misalignment in the natural order of things." Her eyes widened slightly, a shadow of relief and astonishment mingling in her expression. "A misalignment?" she murmured. I had considered the possibility, but I feared it was something more sinister, that it might have been taken." "No, not taken," Holmes replied, fingers drumming lightly against the arm of the sofa. "Rather moved, misplaced, or even folded into some other layer of your environment without conscious intention. Such disturbances are almost always gentle, and yet their effect upon the mind is profound, precisely because they violate the expected pattern of attention." He gestured subtly toward her hands, still resting lightly in her lap. "The way you hold your fingers, the slight tension at your wrists, the attentive spacing of your posture, all these reveal a mind poised between recognition and doubt. It is here that the story of your absent journal begins, not with what has been taken, but with what has been overlooked. I watched her, struck anew by the calm courage that guided her voice, by the unspoken habit of self-restraint that kept her composure in the presence of one whose mind so readily laid bare the minutiae of character. Holmes's observation was exacting but gentle, Watson's perception empathetic, and in that quiet triangle of observation the mystery itself began to take shape. The first stage, Holmes continued, is recognition, acknowledging that something is missing. You have done so with the clarity of a practiced observer. The second stage is inquiry, the patient tracing of one's own actions, noting every movement, every minor detail that could illuminate the path of what was displaced. And the third, often the most delicate, is discovery, when the mind finally perceives the connection that has been hidden by its own habitual attentions. Miss Finch's gaze dropped to the fire, where the embers glowed like tiny galaxies suspended in slow rotation. "I have retraced my steps," she said softly. "I have examined my desk, my books, the stack of sketches, even the window ledge where the light falls in the morning. I find nothing that seems out of place, and yet the absence of the journal looms in every corner." Holmes inclined his head, his long fingers steepled once more. "This is precisely why such a case is not trivial. It is in the ordinary, in the habitual, that the extraordinary may hide. Let us consider, then, the minute circumstances of your day, the meals, the objects, the touch of your hands upon the table, the gestures of your mind as it moved between observation and reflection. Such details are the soil in which the truth grows." Miss Finch's hands twitched slightly, betraying the heightened awareness her own narrative demanded. I remember," she said, her voice catching softly. "It was Wednesday morning. I had breakfast at the table in the conservatory, a simple repast: toast, butter, marmalade, a cup of tea. I was reading a book, a volume by a relative, Professor Alistair Finch. The title was The Secret Life of Lycian. I held it while eating, placing it to mark my place, and yet I remember nothing further until I sought the journal that evening." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly as he leaned forward, the movement slow, deliberate. "And that is where the displacement occurred, not through intention, not through malice, but through the quiet mechanism of the mind, which substitutes habit for attention, and substitutes one object for another when the senses are engaged, but the conscious mind is elsewhere. The journal, a small and familiar companion to your careful observations, has been nested within the book you carried, hidden by the very rituals of attention that give order to your life." She stared at him, a fragile gasp escaping her lips. "You mean—" Her hands moved instinctively toward the satchel beside her, trembling slightly as if acknowledging a truth simultaneously delicate and powerful. Holmes nodded, serene, precisely so. The journal was not lost, Miss Finch. It was merely relocated within the familiar, carried unknowingly by you through the habits of your day. The discovery is not sudden, dramatic, or violent. It is gentle, as is the nature of your life and work. The patterns of attention, the rituals of care, have hidden it from sight until a quiet moment of reflection allows its presence to emerge. With trembling hands she retrieved the book and opened it. There, nestled perfectly between the pages, lay the journal, untouched, preserved in the exact state in which she had left it. The relief on her face was profound, a soft exhalation of breath that seemed to carry away the tension of days spent in anxious anticipation. Watson observed her fingers tracing the lines of her sketches, the careful strokes of pencil and ink restored to continuity, and felt a quiet admiration for the resilience of a mind so attuned to detail and calm. Holmes reclined once more, eyes half closed, a faint smile flickering at the corners of his lips, as if the resolution of the case had reinforced some deep principle known only to him, that the smallest disturbances, when gently traced and attentively observed, reveal the harmony of mind and world alike. Miss Finch looked up, eyes shining in the glow of the hearth, and spoke in a voice of measured wonder. "I cannot thank you enough. It is not merely the journal I have recovered, but the sense of peace it represents, the order, the rhythm, the assurance that my life's careful attentions are not in vain." Holmes inclined his head, a quiet acknowledgment. "It is the ripple upon the pond that matters, not the stone that caused it. Your mind, attuned as it is, has experienced the full extent of the disturbance, and now, in its gentle restoration, finds harmony again." She rose to leave, the fog outside pressing softly against the window, but her steps were light and certain, as if the return of her journal had restored not only an object, but a measure of self-possession. The sound of her departure faded into the quiet hum of London, leaving us once more in the soft contemplative embrace of firelight and shadow. Watson leaned back, the clock ticking in unhurried cadence, the fire's glow warm upon our faces. "A gentle mystery," he murmured, "yet more profound than any violent crime could ever be. It speaks to the mind itself, to the attention we pay or fail to pay, to the quiet disturbances that shape our inner life." Holmes exhaled, a faint curling of smoke rising from his pipe, and replied softly, "Indeed, Watson, there is a subtle poetry in the ordinary. It is here, in the minutiae, in the ripples upon still waters, that life's truest truths reveal themselves, and it is in their discovery, gentle as it must be, that peace may be restored." The fire crackled, the fog rolled thick outside, and the quiet of Baker Street held us in its embrace. The case, though small and unobtrusive to the outside world, had touched the human spirit profoundly, restoring order to a mind attentive, meticulous, and deserving of calm. The journal had returned, but more importantly, the tranquility of the observer had been recovered, and in that quiet restoration, the city itself seemed to exhale, softened by the gentle unfolding of a mystery solved without haste, without violence, and with the patient care of those who notice the smallest ripples. The fog outside Baker Street had settled into a deeper, more contemplative quiet. Lanterns along the street cast soft, trembling halos that shimmered in the moist air, their light diffused like distant stars hiding behind a gauzy veil. The city had exhaled after the subtle ripple of the day, and in the sitting room the fire had softened to a subdued, comforting glow, flickering against the walls as though in gentle agreement with the mood. Miss Finch's departure left the room infused with the residue of her presence, the faint perfume of pressed flowers she favoured, the soft rustle of her cloak against the floorboards, and the echo of a calm, resolute spirit that had braved the scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes without faltering. Her footsteps, once present, had now vanished into the enveloping grey, leaving only the muted hum of the city beyond the fogged windows. Watson, seated near the hearth, allowed a quiet moment to pass before speaking. "There is a strange beauty in that," he murmured, glancing at Holmes. "Not in the discovery itself, though that is satisfying enough, but in the manner of it, how gently a mind, so attentive and deliberate, can restore order to another's disturbance. No confrontation, no drama, merely the quiet unfolding of thought and observation." Holmes stirred slightly, drawing a slow, deliberate inhalation through his pipe. The smoke curled upward, dancing in patterns that seemed to mirror the contemplation within his mind. "Indeed, Watson," he replied, his voice low and contemplative, like the distant toll of a bell in fog-bound streets. "The ordinary, once examined, is rarely so ordinary. There is a subtle rhythm to attention, and even the smallest deviation may echo through the mind. Miss Finch experienced such a deviation, an intrusion upon the carefully maintained harmony of her life. Our task was simply to follow the faint trace, to attend to the minutiae with patience and understanding, nothing more, nothing less." I leaned back in my chair, observing the interplay of shadows upon the walls, noting the small details, the worn pattern of the rug beneath my feet, the gleam of the brass fittings on the fireplace tools, the gentle sway of the curtains stirred by the night air seeping through a slightly ajar window. In all these quiet observations I felt a reflection of the process by which the journal had been found: subtlety, attention, and a patient unfolding of truth. Holmes, observing my gaze, permitted a rare faint smile to cross his features. "And therein lies the true lesson, Watson. A disturbance need not be violent to command notice, nor significant in scale to demand thought. The small ripples, an absent-minded placement, a fleeting inattention, a habitual gesture, are often the ones that reveal character, intention, and meaning. In attending to them, we attend to life itself. I nodded, reflecting on the calm steadiness that Miss Finch had displayed, her quiet dignity, the careful economy of her gestures, and the understated gravity that seemed woven into every movement. "And she carries it lightly, Holmes," I observed. Though the journal's absence distressed her, she bore her concern with a discipline and grace most would envy. There is a serenity to her composure, a rhythm that belies the inattention. Holmes inclined his head, eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled over his chest. "Precisely. Her mind is accustomed to patterns, to repetition, to gentle control over the small domain of her daily life. When a disturbance intruded, even one as trivial as a mislaid journal, it threatened the subtle structure she had built. Restoration, then, is not merely the return of the object, but the re-establishment of order within her consciousness. She leaves now with more than a recovered journal. She departs with a sense of equilibrium, a reaffirmation of the quiet life she has cultivated. The clock ticked steadily upon the mantelpiece, each motion marking not merely the passage of time, but the slow, deliberate unfolding of reflection. The fire, reduced to gentle embers, lent a soft warmth to the room, a tactile reminder of presence and continuity. I found my eyes drifting toward the window, where the fog continued to drift like a river of clouds, dense yet serene, muffling the city and creating a private space for thought. Holmes's voice broke my reverie, low and thoughtful. "Watson, consider the subtle poetry of the ordinary. We are so often drawn to the dramatic, the extraordinary, the headline of action and consequence. And yet, in these quiet disturbances, these gentle misalignments, the world reveals its true texture. Human attention, habit, and the rhythm of ordinary life contain depths that few take the time to explore. The restoration of one mind, as in Miss Finch's case, carries a significance far beyond the moment. It restores continuity, dignity, and the soft music of order." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the day ease from my shoulders. The lesson was not one of mere deduction, nor of analytical triumph, but of empathy, patience, and the mindful observation of life's delicate intricacies. In the soft glow of firelight, the muffled sigh of the fog, and the lingering perfume of pressed flowers, I sensed the profound simplicity of calm restored. Holmes, still reclined, now tapped a slow rhythm with his index finger against the arm of the sofa, as if confirming the harmony of the evening. "And so, Watson, we return to our habitual stillness. There is comfort in the measured pulse of life when it has been momentarily unsettled and then restored. It is the subtle victories, the quiet reconciliations, that shape the world more profoundly than any sensational occurrence. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of the armchair, eyes soft with contemplative understanding. "It is almost a meditation," I said, "to follow the gentle thread, to witness the restoration of order, to share in the quiet triumph of a mind returned to equilibrium. It leaves the heart lighter, the senses attuned, the spirit ready for repose." Holmes, allowing a rare sigh of satisfaction to escape, reclined further, the shadow of his half-closed eyes reflecting the firelight. "And that, Watson, is the ultimate reward of attentiveness and care, to observe, to understand, to restore not through force or spectacle, but through quiet vigilance. In this lies the essence of human connection, the peace of comprehension, and the gentle art of living." The fire burned low, its warmth permeating the quiet room. The fog outside seemed to pulse in time with our measured breathing, a soft lullaby woven from the city itself. I felt the gentle pull of slumber as the quietude of Baker Street enveloped us, the knowledge that the world's subtle disturbances could be attended to, understood, and gently set right. And in that serene glow, the quiet peace of the night, the measured pulse of the clock, and the lingering warmth of fire and reflection, the room became not merely a space of observation, but a sanctuary of calm. The mystery had been resolved, the mind restored, and all was as it should be, a gentle, quiet ending to a day, carried on soft footsteps, muted voices, and the slow, tender rhythm of attention given and peace regained.